Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today is Thursday, August 14th, 2025, and things are really heating up, diplomatically speaking.
They certainly are. Tomorrow, Friday the 15th, we've got U.S. President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin meeting in Alaska. Anchorage, specifically.
Right, Elmendorf-Richardson Air Force Base. And the absolute central focus is, well, it has to be, the war in Ukraine. It's been going on now for, what, 3.5 years?
3.5 years, yes. And this meeting, it's not just routine, it feels pivotal. You know, all these diplomatic efforts happening even while the fighting, the missile attacks, the drone strikes, they just continue day after day.
And what strikes me immediately is just how different their stated goals seem to be going into this. You've got President Trump talking about a ceasefire, a peace deal.
He's even put out warnings, hasn't he? Talking about very severe consequences for Russia if Putin doesn't stop the war. Things like severe secondary tariffs.
Exactly. But then you look at Putin's side, and the sources suggest he's looking to, well, lock in his territorial gains, get sanctions eased, and really reassert Russia on the world stage.
Yeah, it's described almost as a psychological operation from his perspective, less about traditional give-and-take diplomacy.
And it's not just about them, is it? You've got European allies, Ukraine itself, really worried about being sidelined.
Absolutely. They're pushing hard for their interests, Ukraine's territorial integrity, security guarantees. There's a real fear that a direct U.S.-Russia deal could happen over their heads.
So it's complex, deep historical roots, domestic pressures on both sides. It's like a high-stakes chess match.
Definitely.
Which brings us to the core question, really. Can two powerful leaders with such different playbooks actually halt a war that's completely reshaped a continent?
That is the million-dollar question.
So today, that's our mission here on the Deep Dive. We're going to unpack the motivations, the strategies, the objectives of all the key players, the U.S., Russia, Ukraine, Europe. Why is finding lasting peace so incredibly difficult?
And we'll be drawing on the information from the sources we've gathered, laying out the facts as clearly as possible.
Exactly. We aim to report impartially on what the sources say without pushing any specific viewpoint ourselves. Okay, so let's get into it. To understand the summit, we need to understand the drivers. What's fundamentally shaping the U.S. and Russian approaches here?
Well, what's really fascinating, I think, is how much geopolitics and domestic politics are tangled up for both sides. It's not just about the global stage.
Right. It's also about keeping power, keeping support back home.
Precisely. Their strategies, their demands, they're dictated by both internal and external pressures. It makes everything much more complicated.
Okay, let's start with the U.S. approach under President Trump. The sources talk about America first diplomacy, maybe some skepticism about older alliances. What are the key geopolitical aims, and how does the domestic side fit in?
Geopolitically, the consistent message is lasting peace and a ceasefire. President Trump, has often called it Biden's war.
Right, framing it that way. Yeah. And he's openly talked about wanting a Nobel Peace Prize for resolving conflicts.
He has. And alongside that, the warnings to Russia we mentioned, potential large-scale banking sanctions, new tariffs, those severe secondary tariffs if Putin doesn't stop fighting.
There was that shift early on, too, wasn't there? Direct talks.
Yes, a phone call between Trump and Putin where they agreed to start talks immediately. That was a significant move. And another crucial point is this emphasis on burden sharing with Europe.
Ah, yes. The idea that European allies should carry the overwhelming share of aid to Ukraine.
Exactly. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth put it bluntly, the U.S. will no longer tolerate an imbalanced relationship.
And what about NATO for Ukraine? That's always been a flashpoint.
The administration view, articulated by Hegseth, is that NATO membership for Ukraine is, quote, an unrealistic objective for a negotiated settlement.
Okay, so no NATO membership is part of a deal. But what about other security guarantees?
Well, Trump has apparently agreed the U.S. and others should participate in future security guarantees for Ukraine, just explicitly not through the NATO military alliance itself.
Interesting distinction. And there was something about minerals, too, an economic angle.
Yeah, exploring a potential deal with Ukraine, a joint investment fund using Ukraine's mineral resources, oil and gas money for reconstruction. Ukrainian Prime Minister Shmyhal announced a preliminary agreement on that.
That's quite a different approach.
Yeah.
And didn't the U.S. also take a controversial stance at the UN recently?
It did, voting against a European-drafted resolution that criticized Russia and supported Ukraine's territorial integrity. The U.S. proposed its own version without direct criticism of Russia.
That caused some waves.
It certainly did. The U.S. ended up abstaining after pro-Ukraine amendments were added, but later they did say they'd resume intelligence sharing and military aid if Russia agreed to a proposed 30-day ceasefire.
So that's the international picture. How does this connect back to domestic politics in the U.S.? That Biden's war line seems clearly aimed at a home audience.
Oh, absolutely. It's about taking credit for ending the conflict, distancing his administration from its continuation. It plays directly to his base.
And his relationship with Zelenskyy, sources mention some friction.
Yes, President Trump has voiced skepticism, criticizing President Zelenskyy for not holding elections, calling him disrespectful in a White House meeting earlier this year, back in February.
And the land-swapping comments he made before the summit.
That seems like part of a public strategy. Testing the waters, maybe? Though European leaders were quick to warn against negotiating Ukrainian territory without Kyiv actually being involved. Which makes sense.
Of course. What about the pause in U.S. aid earlier? That must have had domestic repercussions.
It did. It drew criticism from Democrats, but also from some Republicans. It highlighted those internal divisions. National Security Advisor Mike Waltz confirmed that pause back in March.
And what are the polls saying about American support for aiding Ukraine now?
Well, Gallup suggests the political will is weakening. These right-wing populist trends focusing more on domestic issues, less on foreign conflicts.
And that's reflected in Ukrainian views of the U.S. too.
Dramatically so. Approval of U.S. leadership among Ukrainians has just plummeted. It was 66% in 2022. Now it's down to 16% in 2025. Disapproval is at 73%. That's a huge shift.
Wow. Okay, let's switch gears to the Russian approach. The sources paint a picture of, well, much deeper geopolitical ambitions and this idea of diplomacy as a psychological battlefield.
Absolutely. For Russia, just having the summit is seen as a win, a preliminary diplomatic victory. It allows Putin to talk about Ukraine's future directly with Washington, essentially going around Kyiv.
And he's trying to appeal to Trump's business side.
Yes, mentioning business instincts, the huge untapped potential in U.S.-Russia economic ties, and significantly, his delegation includes Finance Minister Anton Siluanov.
Which signals what? Sanctions.
Exactly. It signals that economic talks, especially lifting Western sanctions, are a key condition for any kind of peace deal from their side.
Yeah, and territorially, what are they demanding?
The core interest is formalizing their gains, full control, and crucially, U.S. recognition of Donetsk and Luhansk. Plus, retaining the southern parts of Zaporizhia and Kherson, that land bridge to Crimea, is vital for them.
So their main condition is Ukraine withdrawing from those areas.
That, and Kyiv formally renouncing any NATO ambitions. Russia has consistently framed Ukraine joining NATO as a major security threat, even a justification for the invasion itself.
It goes beyond just Ukraine, though, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Some Russian thinkers see this as a bigger struggle.
Very much so. They frame it as a broader fight against U.S. global dominance, against NATO expansion. They talk about dismantling the current world order, even envisioning a new Yalta with leaders like Trump and China's Xi Jinping.
A new Yalta. And there are even more hawkish voices.
Yes, figures like Sergei Karaganov advocate for a more aggressive nuclear deterrent strategy, basically using the threat more proactively to, as they see it, reintroduce fear and cement Russia's great power status.
So it's about global positioning. And domestically, how do they sustain this?
Well, they're prioritizing self-sufficiency in weapons manufacturing and relying heavily on partners like Iran, North Korea, and China for military supplies. It's about long-term sustainability for the war effort.
Okay, back to this idea of this summit as a psychological operation. Can you unpack that a bit more? How does Putin actually approach these meetings differently?
It stems from his KGB background, you see. High-level meetings aren't just about negotiating points for him, they're controlled battlefields. The aim is to weaken the opponent, gain leverage.
How? What kind of tactics?
Things like staged anecdotes, using silence strategically, intense stares, trying to exploit perceived personal vulnerabilities. He apparently prefers informal settings to catch those unguarded moments.
Fascinating. And part of the strategy is controlling the narrative.
Absolutely. The Kremlin consistently tries to paint President Zelenskyy as the one prolonging the war. If Kyiv rejects Russia's terms, you can bet Moscow will claim Ukraine is blocking peace.
And this plays domestically in Russia, too.
Yes. Amplifying external threats helps justify internal repression and rally support for the war, especially when facing economic or military difficulties. And any meeting like this, state media will spin it as proof of Putin's enduring global importance and strength.
So with all this maneuvering between the U.S. and Russia, where does that leave Ukraine and the European allies? They must be feeling anxious.
Profoundly concerned is probably the right way to put it. They worry these bilateral talks could sideline their interests, maybe even lead to a deal that favors Moscow.
Their message seems pretty clear, though.
Unequivocal, really. Ukraine and Europe must be part of any negotiations, and Ukraine specifically saying talks about us without us will not work.
In key European leaders, UK, France, Germany, are they holding the line on Ukraine's sovereignty?
Yes, consistently reaffirming commitment to Ukraine's territorial integrity, the line is international borders cannot be and must not be changed by force.
And security guarantees remain crucial for them.
Critical. They need robust and credible guarantees. There's talk of a coalition of the willing to help police any future peace deal. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer even mentioned readiness to deploy UK troops as part of such a deal.
Wow, deploying troops. And the UK has made some long-term commitments, too.
Huge ones. Reaffirmed unwavering support, a 100-year partnership agreement, and committing at least £3 billion a year in military aid until 2030 or 2031. That's significant.
That is a strong signal. But you mentioned earlier this shift in Ukrainian public opinion. That sounds like a major change. Are the Ukrainian people themselves still fully behind fighting on?
This is where the sources show a really stark, almost surprising shift. There's deep skepticism about these high-level summits solving anything quickly.
Skepticism, okay. But is the desire to fight changing?
Dramatically. That Gallup poll from early July shows 69% of Ukrainians now favor a negotiated end to the war as soon as possible.
69%, that's huge. What was it before?
It's described as a nearly complete reversal from 2022, when 73% supported fighting until victory.
Wow. That really speaks to war weariness setting in.
It absolutely does. The sources quote, ordinary Ukrainians. One Kyiv resident, Alexandra Kozlova, basically said she doesn't expect this summit to be decisive, doesn't see changes coming.
And another.
A car salesman, Anton Vishniak, said saving military lives should be the priority now, even if it means making territorial concessions. That's a tough sentiment to hear, but it reflects the changing mood.
And what about hopes for joining NATO or the EU? Have those dimmed too?
Significantly. Hopes for quick NATO membership are down to 32%, from 64% back in 2022. And a third now think Ukraine will never be accepted. EU hopes are also down to 52%.
So, okay. We have clashing objectives between the U.S. and Russia. We have Europe trying to maintain a united front. We have this major shift in Ukrainian public feeling. Where does this actually leave the prospects for peace? What are the absolute biggest hurdles?
Well, the core issue, it hasn't really changed. Neither side seems willing to end the war on terms the other could possibly accept.
Ukraine still insists on getting all its territory back, including Crimea, and no ditching NATO plans.
Exactly. And Russia demands huge political changes in Kyiv, that formal rejection of NATO and Ukrainian withdrawal from all the regions Russia partially occupies.
And these aren't just negotiating points, are they? They feel deeper.
That's the crucial insight, I think. These demands are seen as existential on both sides. For Ukraine, it's about their very existence as a sovereign nation. For Russia, it seems tied to this idea of their imperial legacy, pushing back against the West.
An irreconcilable clash of identities almost.
That might be the biggest barrier of all. Some experts quoted even think President Trump now recognizes Putin isn't genuinely interested in peace on acceptable terms.
Which would imply?
That sustained military and political support for Ukraine is still necessary, even while seeking a deal. But at the same time, there's this growing hesitancy in the West about providing truly game-changing aid.
And the weakening political will back home, as you mentioned.
Right. It all adds up to a very, very difficult path towards any kind of lasting resolution.
So wrapping this up, the picture from our sources is pretty stark. This Trump-Putin summit feels like a major clash of objectives. The U.S. wants a practical end, maybe driven partly by domestic concerns. Europe is trying to hold the line on sovereignty.
Well, Russia seems focused on formalizing games and playing a strategic, maybe even psychological long game.
And underneath it all, this huge shift in Ukraine. People are weary, ready for negotiations, but also deeply skeptical.
Profoundly skeptical.
So as we look towards tomorrow's meeting in Alaska, it makes you wonder, considering the deep motivations, the tactics, the different ideas of what peace even means, how much of this is truly about ending the war?
And how much is about shaping the narrative for the world and maybe more importantly for audiences back home?
It forces you to ask, doesn't it? What do these major players really stand to gain right now from prolonging this conflict versus ending it? And ultimately, what does any outcome mean for the ordinary people caught in the middle?
That's the heavy question hanging over Anchorage tomorrow.